Hey 3DMJers, this is Andrea Valdez, and you're listening to the 3D Muscle Journey podcast. This is our 220th episode, and as we do every 10th episode, this is an audience-supplied Q&A session where we do our best to answer as many queries as possible throughout the duration of the show. Today, I'll be doing the asking, and Brian Miner and Eric Helms will be doing the answering. All of these questions from today came from one of our recent YouTube live AMA sessions. Eric hosted our first one ever a couple months back, and there were like a trillion questions, and there was no way he could get through all of them in the 1 hour time slot. But as promised, we saved a bunch of the unanswered ones and have them here for you on the show today. So, topics covered in this episode will include how to design a program where hypertrophy and strength are both prioritized, how to handle a cold or flu while in a cut or prep, whether or not it's possible to develop a competitive physique using only compound movements, whether or not we'd recommend creating a prep deficit entirely via lists without dropping calories too much, how and when someone should prioritize hydration, how we handle non-responders to weight training, what are the potential pros and cons of having a body part split program versus a more full body program, whether or not concurrent athletes should avoid cutting, how to define mechanical tension and how we should account for it, how you would know when you can no longer recomp and are forced to either cut or bulk, what we think about long-term volume cycling, how to program for a powerlifter looking to stay in the same weight class, how to know if you're overreaching or overtraining, what we think of running very long hypertrophy phases as a powerlifter, and where we see the fitness industry going in the next 10 years and what contributions we hope to make during that time. It's a lot of questions. We hit them all in this one. As always, if you have any feedback or comments on this particular episode, go ahead and let us know over on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/team3dmj and leave your comment under podcast number 220. So let's get into it. Here is Q&A session 22 with Brian Miner and Eric Helms. Okay, question 1. How do you design a program where hypertrophy and getting strong are the same priority goals?
That's a good question.
Isn't it?
Brian, I've heard you do powerlifting as well as bodybuilding. Is that true?
It is. You just have to accept that you're just going to be lackluster in both of them.
Correct. It is the coping method of basically sealing your own fate to be bad at both, and then you always have an excuse.
Exactly.
Same reason I choose to be natural, actually, so that if I'm small, I can always have that as a defense. Yeah. No, but seriously, Brian, how do you take this approach with your clients and yourself?
You know, I think I look at it more from the perspective of, I think, strength specifically, and how hypertrophy is a large element of strength expression. So I think when you kind of think of them as like hypertrophy is an actual adaptation and strength is simply like the expression of multiple adaptations, then I think it's easier for them to coexist or to realize that they can. So, you know, a lot of powerlifters, you know, in the off season, you know, they're still going to be doing a reasonable amount of volume. It's like the vehicles that we use to, you know, drive that volume. It might be more specific to the competition lifts, but, you know, I think there's still hypertrophy that's occurring in the presence of getting stronger. And I think it's more just a matter of dialing up or down, you know, exercise specificity and, you know, getting strong, like, I mean, getting strong in low rep ranges, you know, you're probably going to benefit from, you know, some top sets, something that's just, in my experience, just a small, low debt exposure to high intensities, you know, that isn't going to really contribute to much overall fatigue. And, you know, when we look at the different elements of fatigue, it's like the high intensity work isn't really what's driving a lot of that anyway. So it's getting enough of that to, you know, maintain proficiency. And then when you kind of want to specialize a bit more in the high intensity work, you can do that for a 4 to 6 week period, 8 weeks maybe, and then you'll kind of treat that as a way to kind of resensitize to the volume when you come back. So I think they can work hand in hand. I don't think the power lifts are the best tools for hypertrophy, but I also think I don't think they're as horrible as a lot of people make them out to be either.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think a lot of it just comes down to opportunity cost. A power lifter is figuring out how much time and energy do I have for accessory work to maximize hypertrophy while working on strength. Anyways, many times. And at times that will result in doing less than what would be on paper ideal to maximize muscle size, especially when they're close to a competition, like you're saying. So the only little shift in perspective when your goal is to maximize hypertrophy and strength kind of as a default all the time setting is just shifting that opportunity cost a little differently, so that there are times when you are doing that like a power lifter, but there's other times when maybe you're doing the opposite, where you're thinking about what's the minimum high intensity, lowest fatigue exposure, and I use fatigue more broadly, of strength work that I can do without it getting in the way from an opportunity cost perspective for bodybuilding. So if, let's say I think it's just for demonstration purposes, let's say you're competing in both bodybuilding and powerlifting. I think that makes it a little easier. Let's say you're a year out from a meet. You might just be doing one single a week on, the big three. If you're focusing on, hey, the next thing I got coming up is a bodybuilding season. And that single might be at like a 6 RPE, on squat, bench, and deadlift. And that is something you might kick the workout off with. And then you're jumping into non-specific work that has maybe, to quote, the RP folks, a lower stimulus to fatigue ratio or higher stimulus to fatigue ratio. Nonetheless, it's not as fatiguing, but it produces a pretty good stimulus. I think that's probably a better approach than your more, I'm going to say old school, but I mean like 5 years ago, power building approach that has become popular, where it's like, okay, if I'm trying to get big and strong, I'm just going to do like 4x8 on squats, bench, and deadlift. I think that is that's a great way to run into the limits of what you can recover from and deal with mentally and physically, rather than saying, a top single at a 6 and then jumping on a leg press as an example. So yeah, I tend to agree with you. I think the only time you really have to kind of juggle is when you're doing something like, what I want to do? I want to compete in a lower weight class in powerlifting while I'm cutting for bodybuilding, and I'm competing within the same quarter of the year. That's when you have to think about what does that calculus look like. But I think most of the time you should actually have a little phasic of approach, where you're kind of phasing in more work on strength, and then your accessories, quote unquote, are what you fit in, kind of similar to a power lifter. But then most of the time you're operating in this kind of more hypertrophy, or the opposite, not most of the time, depending on whatever your goals are. But when you're not doing that, it's more hypertrophy specific with just the minimum amount of work to get the job done. So I think a key piece of homework for someone who wants to do this is to figure out what their kind of minimum dose to make progress on the big three are, with using a more specific, lower volume, single-based approach, which I think is probably the most efficient way to do it. And then also, what do you need to not lose size? And it's typically less than most people think.
Yeah.
Agreed.
That's interesting, because you're like, most people would do the 4x8, like see how much I can fit, when it's like the actual smartest thing would be see how little you can do. Cool.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, like, and I think with the power lifts, it's like if you're using those as the way to accrue a bunch of volume, I think you have to realize like specificity is load dependent as well. It's like the way you lift, with a set of 8 is going to be different than the way you lift with a 1RM. So I think that sort of gets lost in that message as well, as people assume it's like, okay, it's more practice with the lift, but it's being performed and coordinated differently, by your nervous system when it's lighter loads.
Because you have to get better at 1RM squats for the sport, not just squatting.
Yep.
Like, there's no need to just do 1,000.
Yeah, you could make an argument that a 1RM box squat is more specific to a comp squat than, let's say, a low bar box squat to depth, right? Is more specific than doing a set of, 8 high bar squats, but to depth,
Yeah.
or maybe even low bar, even though it's the same, one's a variation on the movement, the other one's the same, but the other one's with like 75% on 1RM.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember having arguments back in the day with people on why they don't need to put belts on when they're doing their warm-ups with like the bar or 60 when they're going to work up to 200 kilos. And I'm like, listen, you're increasing the specificity on something that's already completely non-specific. We're definitely majoring, not even in the minors, but in the doesn't matters.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. On to the next one. Yeah. Question 2, contracting a cold or flu while in a cut or prep. Would you advise to stick to the deficit or go back to maintenance until you're over the illness?
Well, Brian, since you just survived the bird flu, I think you're probably the most qualified to talk about this.
It was a close call, friends.
Yeah, as
close
a
call.
potential bird flu survivor. I mean, I didn't diet the past few days. No.
How to survive the bird flu? Don't diet.
Don't diet.
Listeners, he did not have the bird flu.
I did not have the bird flu.
Just for the record.
Just Kaiser likes to put the wrong thing on pieces of paper.
I got misdiagnosed with the bird flu, which was hilarious and terrifying for a brief moment in time. So, I think, Eric, you might be more familiar with actual research on this area. For me, it's like, if we're talking 3 or 4 days, it's like, it's not going to hurt to get yourself out of the deficit. I mean, if you're not training, like, that's just going to benefit you further. It's like, you're just going to be in a better spot. Once you do come back and you're recovered, fatigue levels, will, on the training front, probably be somewhat reduced. But I think it's, I think there's more to gain from just bringing your calories up for a few days than try to lose, an extra few ounces of body fat in the process of that also.
That's exactly how I see it. It's a high risk, low reward scenario. Like, you know what? I think I could survive. I think I could beat this flu even while I'm still dieting. And you gain half a week of a deficit, but you potentially end up being sick for twice as long.
Exactly.
And just not being able to train longer and probably losing muscle from inability to train effectively. So yeah, it doesn't really make sense to me. It's a, I think, bigger picture. This question is often asked out of fear. And fear is the mind killer, as a great book said, Dune, if you're not aware. I'm a nerd. That is basically, when you're asking a question out of fear, you can almost be sure that the fear-based response to that is not the right thing, or it's at least missing a few things. Unless, of course, it's like duck or run or jump and you're being attacked. Those are the times when fear is useful, but not like game planning your contest prep. With that said, I will say that we're probably a little more resilient than we realize. If you have like a head cold that hasn't extended into your chest, you've been dieting, you have a 24-week diet plan and you're on week 3 and your body fat percentage is still reasonably high, it probably doesn't matter at all. Immune suppression doesn't just come from having insufficient calories. It also comes from being in a state of low energy availability for a long time, and probably more so. So I think there is some context here as to if you have a head cold and you started contest prep last week versus you're shredded, you've competed twice, you feel terrible all the time, your immune system is suppressed, and that's why you got sick. Yes, you need to come out of a deficit and address that. And then your decision between those two extremes can scale. But I think my default would still probably be go to maintenance, don't train, fully recover, and then get back to doing things in an ideal way. It's kind of the idea. It's this constant thing where people want to deny reality to try to get closer to optimal, when the true way of being optimal is accepting the constraints and the reality that you're in and optimizing within them. And I think once you think of it from that perspective, it's really hard to see it another way. This isn't a gamble that I would recommend someone take.
Agreed.
Boom. Cool. All right. Question 3. Is it possible to develop a competitive physique using only compound movements? I mean, even the long head of the tricep works in rows. We could include or not include that second statement, but do you have to do accessories to look legit?
I mean, I think it's competitive is subjective here. I think maybe the question, what they're thinking is like, can I reach my full potential only doing compounds? And I would say probably close to it, but would lean towards no. Because, you know, there are some muscle groups, you know, that are far from the limiting factor on a lot of exercises. You know, your long head of your triceps does get worked in rows, but you're probably not maximally developing that through doing rows. So, but yeah, there's a lot of people that just get compounds in and they build very impressive physiques. But I guess when I look at this question, I'm like, okay, well, why, like, do you not have access to isolation, you know, ability to do isolation work? Is it, if you just have a power rack, like, then kind of going back to the last question, it's like optimize within the constraints that you have and just be okay with that.
And also just be creative, because you can still do a sissy squat and you can do a barbell curl and you can do a skull crusher, you know?
Yeah.
And you can do a single leg bodyweight calf raise. Most people who weigh a fair amount can only get like 15 reps with those. Like I weigh 210 and I think my PR is 17 reps on a single leg bodyweight calf raise, with a nice pause at the bottom. So you'd be surprised what you can do even with minimal equipment. But yeah, the thing I was thinking when I saw this question, I was like, this is someone who's potentially influenced by anecdotes, you know, seeing people have amazing physiques with or without taking these approaches. And I think we can also use a theoretical anecdote to understand why maybe that's not the best approach. Like, let's say Lee Haney or Dorian Yates or Ronnie Coleman did no isolation work and they just did rows, presses, squats, and hinges. They would probably still be top 3 in the Olympia. And you'd be like, oh shit, look at this person, top 3 in the Olympia who only uses compounds. You know?
Yeah.
Would they be 6 and 7 and 8 time Mr. Olympias? Maybe, maybe not. But I think you can tell that, like, that example doesn't mean much. And then you can look at someone who has just terrible genetics, but is very smart and has a YouTube channel and gets the constant, like, you know, do you even lift, bro? And they're like, this person doesn't look that good and they do all this isolation work. They should just be focusing on heavy, hard compounds. Like, in both cases, the signal and the noise is misevaluated. Someone's genetics and how long they've been training and other factors like effort are going to far outweigh the benefits they get from doing isolation approaches. But I think if we understand what are we talking about here, what's the possible upside, and it's a small benefit to specific muscle groups like the long head of your tricep, the short head of your hamstring, your calves, your biceps, your rectus femoris, then why not, right? You technically, maybe your traps, your abs, you know, it depends on how far we take this whole I only do compounds thing. And also just as a, to kind of speak about functional anatomy a little bit, isolation movements aren't as isolation-y as we think, and compounds aren't as, like, there's not as much of a hard line in the sand as we think. So I think you also don't need to go to the other extreme and be like, well, the only way to know for sure is we have to get the right biased angle and isolate movements, and we need the right handle, and we need to think about the line of pull and all this stuff. I think there is a scalable amount of focus you should have on this topic related to your goals and how far you've pushed it. And but I think a healthy middle ground to have your default starting position is foundation of compound movements, and then sprinkle in the accessories based on what seems to grow or not grow. And then also, you know, base your exercise selection on where you seem to get growth or not, and where you do or don't have a good mind-muscle connection. I think those are all valuable ways to individualize.
Agreed.
All right. Next question. Thoughts on contest prep with a deficit for most, if not entirely, from lists, given no time constraints to do cardio and no clear detriments to gym performance for someone who would prefer higher calories. So, in short, can I just cardio my deficit all the way through a prep without dropping my food too much.
Herman Poncer would say it's a bad idea.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think there's a limit. You know, there's a limit to how efficient cardiovascular activity can be. And, you know, when low states of energy availability, you know, that's going to, it's just going to exacerbate that. Like, and it's not efficient. I think that's the biggest thing is like how it's not hard to eat a couple hundred calories less compared to like doing 200 extra calories worth of, especially low intensity cardio. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's like, you know, 4,000 plus steps probably for most people. So it's like, it's substantial. I think this is another like hypothetical question that, I think you'd realize pretty quick wouldn't play out the way maybe you would hope. But I think, you know, for some people, you know, if their energy expenditure is very low as is, and it's like you're trying to create this necessary deficit, you know, however you can, but reducing food intake further is like they still have to be eating something, you know, like increasing less amounts to greater degrees, I think can be helpful. But even then it's a difficult situation because if they have a low, you know, energy expenditure, they're probably going to be smaller individuals more often than not, and they're going to be burning less through that. So it's, yeah, I try to, when possible, have it be kind of a balanced split. Probably favoring diet to a larger degree to create the deficit. I can't think of a situation where I've had the deficit like entirely created, at least in a contest prep scenario where it's all from cardio.
Yeah, I kind of have three angles that I would tackle this question from. One is the psychological, which is probably most important. Two is the logistical, which is more relevant if you get past the psychological point that I'll get to. And then finally, there's the, hey, let's talk fun science stuff, which I'll get to as well. Psychologically, from a coaching perspective, if someone said to me, hey, I want to eat more food, I don't want to reduce my calories at all, so I want to diet purely from getting a lot of cardio in, I'd say now's probably not the time for you to diet. If the idea, like, because you have these two conflicting drivers. You're trying to get leaner. You're for whatever reason, you either want to compete, or you're not happy with your body, or your doctor said, hey, I think you'd benefit from this, or whatever reason. You also have a lot of resistance to that right now. If cutting 200-300 calories is something, you're like, nope, I'd rather do an hour of cardio. So to me, my first thought is you're probably not in a good headspace right now to diet. So I wouldn't suggest it. It's not going to go well. And if it does go well and you crush yourself with cardio, Biggest Loser style, you're probably going to regain a lot of weight because the energy deficit will still be there, as inefficient as it might be, and it will still create cravings. And you will still have all the same physiological adaptations that will just compound with your current psychological status where you're like, I don't want to touch my diet because I'm enjoying my food. So probably not a good play right now, just based upon the question for this individual to cut. And for coaches, I think this should be a little bit of a red flag if you could ask this question. Logistically, 100% agree with Brian. And just to give some numbers, average person who weighs like 160 something, 170 pounds, who's doing, an hour of cardio, if it's LISS, 200 calories.
Yeah.
You know? So that kind of sucks. And it's just not very efficient. So you end up having to do some pretty gnarly amounts. Totally agree with Brian from a logistical perspective. People with smaller bodies who weigh less, they're going to have to do more cardio just to make sure that we don't have to dip down into like low micronutrient, low quality, have some vegetables and lean protein only diets. Although that often does inevitably happen with lower weight classes for bodybuilding. The final one, just scientifically, there are differences between quote unquote metabolic adaptation and energy compensation. And you can see people who are doing very high amounts of activity that are not necessarily experiencing massive amounts of weight loss or creating a huge energy deficit, where that does not create an additive effect. It creates a constrained effect on the energy expenditure. So they see reductions in energy expenditure from other things. Neat. Potentially even accelerating the processes that would look like metabolic adaptation, as reductions come from other non-activity bases. So I think there's sufficient evidence to say that, yeah, if you were dieting and doing a ton of cardio, you might accelerate some of these adaptations that fight against weight loss more than if you were using a more even split of the two. So yeah, it wouldn't be my play. I think typically when I'm getting someone up into the 10 to 15,000 steps per day, going over that is something that I do cautiously. And just because it's also just less predictable. It's harder to be like, oh, if I add X number of steps, I'll see this amount of weight loss. Not that it's perfectly predictable with cutting calories, but it's there's a whole lot of hours in the day when you're awake that aren't the 1 hour of cardio you're doing, where you can find ways to trim calories. And that difference between, let me cut 200 calories from your intake doesn't seem as quickly and well able of the body to regulate against it. That's more of an anecdotal experience from watching people do insane amounts of cardio relative to how much you'd expect them to lose, but seeing more, still obvious reductions in weight loss from metabolic adaptations when cutting calories, but not to the same degree.
I agree.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's no clear detriments on gym performance. I think that only lasts so long. Like, yeah, if you're doing a 3-week cut or a month, but like if you have a 6-month prep at some point with that
Case
many
in point,
steps.
Jeff hurt his foot using
Walking.
steps.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
There's just like, it's literally like, I know it's just walking, but at some point that accumulation of volume, if you only increase and increase and increase over the short amount of time, which is still short, like prep, within 9 months of your life, if you just keep going, at some point, you might not be able to leg press or squat as much, I would gather. Yeah. Something's going to hurt 100%. Before, even if like you can do it, it's like, are you in pain? Yeah. At some point. Okay, cool. Next question. How much do you prioritize hydration? Is it a normal part of your day, or do you go out of your way to ensure you're properly hydrated?
Yeah, or go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I generally think of having fluids with each meal and then between meals. So I'm having maybe 5 or 6 effortful attempts of getting in fluids. With the goal, and this is the way I think you kind of gauge it, of having 3+ urinations per day that are reasonably not yellow, clearish. Understanding the first one in the morning, it's probably gonna be more yellowy because you have not had fluids for 8 hours. Unless you're in your 30s like I am and you wake up reliably in the middle of the night and drink water and pee because prostate. But cool. Yeah, it's good times. And
bonus question there, in case you're wondering.
Yeah. What's it like to be in your 30s and try to sleep through the night? If your name is Eric Helms. So yeah, that's you're welcome for that answer. So yeah, I think generally just thirst, frequency of urinations, and clarity of urine are probably your best kind of individual tools. The reason why I don't like to give absolute numbers in terms of liters is because people have different sweat rates, and that can be heavily modified by your environment. Someone who has a higher sweat rate, who trains in a non-air conditioned facility near the equator, is going to have a very different answer than someone who trains in an air conditioned and central heated facility in Norway and doesn't sweat very much. So
yeah. I mean, everything you said, I agree with. I think it's something I think people maybe obsess over excessively sometimes, but I also think it's something like that. Like I sometimes have bad sessions and I realize like, okay, why did that happen? And it's like, oh, I had 12 ounces of water this entire day, and so like there's a happy medium there. And so kind of what Eric said is, if you're having, multiple close to clear urinations a day and you're just making an effort each time you eat and maybe between meals to have some liquid, I mean, you're probably going to be okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, like it's not a problem unless it is. That's
Exactly.
essentially it. Yeah. Okay.
But yeah, I don't think you need to carry around like a gallon jug with like the motivational quotes on it.
But you look so cool when you do it, though.
You're definitely a part of the bodybuilding crew.
Yeah.
I have seen people who just don't have a very strong thirst response get this sometimes wrong. Like you only pee twice a day. It's relatively dark. The volume isn't very high.
Mm-hmm.
And, you have headaches regularly and you notice changes in your physique a lot, even in the off season.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's a sign that you're potentially swinging into dehydration semi-regularly.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah. I find it happens a lot with people who do a lot of work and are good at focusing and just doing the task.
Mm-hmm. They just
like
forget.
you just forget about it. Yeah.
Yep.
Cool. All right. Next question. What do you suggest for non-responders? I've been following your approach. So I guess 3D, the pyramids, whatever. I've been following your approach on sets, but hardly any change. Should I first try low volume training or high volume training?
I think the kind of, if this was an athlete of mine or somebody inquiring, I would first sort of audit like what exercises are you doing and how are you performing them? And I don't think it necessarily as long as we're training the musculature that we want, then we can kind of move on to the next step. But sometimes there's situations where people are, clearly like maybe on squats, they're squatting really shallow, and they're doing a lot of volume. It's like, okay, if we can comfortably, increase your range of motion, you're going to get more out of each set. So I think that is kind of the first thing I would look at. But other than that, I think it kind of comes down to trial and error. And, if you push volume a little bit further, then, if you start to see performance regress, then you probably know you're doing too much. And then maybe you can try a lower volume approach with, your peak of your inverted U curve could be, further to the left than the average person. So, and maybe, your effort per set needs to be greater, or maybe it needs to be reduced if you're training to failure. So I think it's hard to say based off of the information provided, but the main point I wanted to make was just that exercise execution, I think, is a place to start before you tamper with volume.
I agree with that. I think there's the language in this question, I think, also makes me want to address the psychology a little bit. It sounds like this person is plateaued and they want to know what to do. But I think it's interesting that they're describing themselves as a non-responder. So it might be worth just, if you are listening to this, or if you're someone who would describe a plateau as I'm a non-responder, think about that. You can probably identify that you have some beliefs about yourself of I'm not expecting myself to be able to make progress. I don't have what it takes or what have you. And I think that can sometimes be a limiting belief. I'm not saying it's going to take the same program and make it work versus not work, but I think probably a more facilitative attitude is to acknowledge, okay, right now I'm plateaued. And when someone is plateaued, I think there is a pretty good flow chart to work through. The first one is to assess, are you actually plateaued? Are you just not progressing at a rate that your workout partner or someone you saw online or your friend or what you think your rate should be? And that's a whole other can of worms. But, generally novices, like true novices, been lifting, less than 6 months, seriously, you probably every time you repeat an exercise, be able to improve in some way performance-wise. And then once that slows down to weekly or every other week, you can consider yourself an intermediate. And then eventually I've got to follow a full program, see what happens. And then, okay, did I make progress in every 8 to 12 weeks? And now you're somewhere in the advanced kind of category. So if you are actually plateaued, like Brian, I think I would suggest having a number of things that you check to make sure that it's not specifically related to the program. Are you getting sufficient sleep? Are you eating a sufficient amount of energy? Do you have a sufficient amount of protein? is your proximity to failure being accurately gauged, which would come from like having someone audit your performance, right? Is your technical ability of, you know, using these exercises actually going to put a stimulus on the target muscles? And then from there, if the answer is no, I've sorted all that and I am plateaued, then the question is, okay, so what do we do about it? And I do think the approach that makes more sense is to start on the lower end of the volume range, somewhere between 6 to 10 sets per muscle group, with a relatively high effort. Because then from there, you can pretty damn reasonably assume if you're not progressing at any kind of visible rate, the answer would be to do more. However, when you're doing a high volume approach, you don't know which direction you need to go necessarily. So I think it does make sense to start on the lower end and go from there.
I like that.
Nice. All right. Next. What are the potential pros and cons of having a body part split program versus a non-split program? So I think they're talking about like chest day, leg day kind of sitch versus not, versus combining.
So is this asking, the way I kind of read this was like a once a week, training a muscle group once a week versus
maybe,
or even a push-pull legs versus like a mixed, I don't know.
Chest and back, shoulders and arms, legs.
I think some of this comes down to the psychological aspect. Like on paper, for me, doing some semblance of full body probably makes more sense, but I just don't enjoy it as much. Like I like being able to have like a focused effort, you know, on one particular group of muscles. Doesn't like, I don't do a chest day, but I think it's important to have it broken up enough where the volume that you're performing is quality volume and you're not seeing this like large drop off in performance and, you know, acute, you know, within session fatigue variables are contributing to, you know, a reduction in the stimulus. So, so I think there's a middle ground there that's probably good for most people. And then, I mean, Eric, you did like the 6 full day muscle group, or full body per week. And so we're probably 5 days. And I think there are benefits like scheduling wise for that, because you're never more than a day or two away from having trained that muscle group. So it's like you don't feel like you're behind. And I think mentally that can be kind of beneficial if your schedule's a little bit erratic. But I think as long as volumes matched and you're probably training things more than just once a week, I think it's probably doesn't make a huge difference with all else equal.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think, the details of this question matter because there are body part splits where you end up training a muscle group every 7 days, and there's body part splits where it's 2 times a week. I used to run a chest and back, legs, shoulders, arms, off, upper, lower back in the day. And I've done also legs, push, pull, off, you know. You could argue those are body part splits, but they are a higher frequency approach compared to 1 times per week. The data is interesting on this. If you were to look at the most recent meta-analyses on both strength and hypertrophy, they're all neutral to maybe positive for some strength metrics for higher frequency training, even when volume is matched. But for the most part, the findings are that higher frequency programs are a proxy for higher volume. And when you control for volume, you don't see much of a difference. There's like I think it's bench press strength is the one small effect size outlier that I've seen in the data. But I don't know if that's real. For the most part, though, if you're doing matched volume, like Brian said, the findings seem to be pretty similar. However, there was a recent study that got published, and I'm going to pull it up while I'm talking, but I'll explain the results while I grab it. Where what they did was they trained 2 different conditions where they didn't match volume, and they split these groups up into different frequencies, matched volume, and different frequencies allowed to get more volume. So basically, one group distributed it across the days, and they were doing more reps just based upon going to failure, like what they could do, to see if spreading out allowed them to get more volume in terms of actual tonnage, like sets times reps times load, to see if that ability to have, you know, fewer sessions or fewer exercises for a given muscle group in a session allowed them to do more. And they were able to get significantly more volume, and the results like slightly leaned in favor of you know, better outcomes in the group that had the non-matched volume. So that kind of supports the idea that you can use frequency as a way to allow yourself to get more volume and to basically distribute volume. And that's kind of the way I've always thought of higher frequency approaches, that they're to accommodate higher volumes. Because we don't have a ton of research on the amount of volumes that most bodybuilders are training with. You know, like your average natural bodybuilder, according to a recent survey, is doing, you know, mid 20 sets per muscle group, you know, and that's not to say that everyone's doing that. There's plenty of people doing 10, 12, 15, and that's totally fine. But if you're in the stage of your career, or you're someone individually who benefits from doing, say, double-digit or higher number of sets per muscle group, you get to a point where getting more, say, than like 9 sets for a muscle group in a given session just noticeably reduces the quality of effort, focus, and creates a really large sink of damage and soreness that you would think probably is not ideal. I don't have data to back that up, because there's just not a lot of studies on, hey, we're doing 20 sets and we're going to split it up. It's always comparing like 9 sets at most, typically. So anyway, that study I was referring to is the effect of different training frequencies on maximal strength performance and muscle hypertrophy in trained individuals or within subject design. So it's kind of a cool study that suggests, you know, if you want to see if you can accumulate more volume, you can accomplish that by spreading things out. But I think there is probably a time and a place for that. If you're someone who is performing 10 sets or less per muscle group, I think you can get away with even a 1 times per week frequency, and you're probably not sacrificing much. So I think this is one of those things where it's like, not only that it doesn't matter, it's just that we don't have any clear indications that one approach is better than the other, so you can let individual preferences and anecdotal experiences dictate. So the reason why I trained 5 days a week, quote unquote, full body, not really full body, I don't train every muscle group every single time, is that I find if I'm doing more than 1, maybe 2, especially compound leg exercises in a given day, I see pretty large drop-offs in ability to focus, put forth effort, motivation, and high levels of fatigue. So I can get more out of my training by just having like leg press and calf raises on one day, hamstring curls and calf raises on another day, squat and deadlift all on separate days. So I kind of, that way, each time I come to one of those big compound exercises, I can put forth my best effort. And I find that results in the highest net sustained effort and successful levels of motivation and enjoyment over the course of a program. So that's just my psychology. And it also overlaps with the fact that I don't seem to need or respond better to higher volumes for my lower body, but I do respond to higher volumes for my upper body. So each one of us is a convergence of things like that, psychologically and physiologically. So I think you have the free range to figure out what's the best approach for you, given that we have that data that is ambiguous, which means you can probably tailor it to yourself.
Yeah, I like it. You know, one thing I like pairing is like chest and back, because from a time efficiency perspective, I feel like I'm still resting like in between sets of chest. Like I end up saving time in the long run, but I don't feel like my performance really suffers because I end up resting longer between sets of the same exercise. So I like doing that. I don't like just being like idle for 4 minutes at a time, you know, and I think that's just my personal preference. But granted, I mean, some movements, you know, higher rep ranges, it's going to be a different story. But yeah, I like getting a pump when it's bodybuilding.
Brian Arnold.
The full body thing, I think logistically can be really helpful, and I have used approaches like that. I mean, pretty much every powerlifting program is, you know, with any semblance of frequency more than once a week is going to have some overlap there. But I do think, yeah, my preference is just kind of splitting it up a little, but not to the point where it's like 20 sets of chest, 20 sets of back, like that.
Yeah.
100%.
Another weird thing, I don't know if it's weird, but like my shoulders feel better on bench if I vertically press and or row. Mm-hmm. So I like putting all that on the same day.
Yeah.
Okay. I also just can't do a full complement of arms on the same day or I get elbow tendonitis. So like there are
another thing. Yeah, like joint.
Yeah. There's old people considerations that you should listen to us all in our 30s telling you about.
All in our late 30s now. Brian, I just turned 37, so I'm part of the group now.
You're welcome.
Thanks.
Yeah, welcome. I will be leaving you in 5 months. So.
Hey 3DMJers, Andrea Valdez here to tell you all about the Lifting Library 6.0, our latest update to our flagship video course in the 3DMJ Vault. The Lifting Library is our all-in-one educational solution to perfecting the essential movements and exercises that every bodybuilder needs to know and execute well. We just released new videos yesterday, and the course now includes a total of 42 chapters, covering every classic barbell and dumbbell lift, loads of bodyweight and machine exercises, warm-ups, BFR training, and even a downloadable PDF chapter on how to build a program. Each of those exercise chapters has a super detailed instructional video with multiple angles, freeze frames with graphics, and educational voiceovers by our Chief Science Officer, Eric Helms. Each one also has a text-based supplemental section that outlines those key performance takeaways, and most importantly, a programming considerations section, which tells you exactly how each lift should fit into a program based on your physique and goals. This new batch of learning chapters that we just released includes further deadlift variations, leg extension variations, overhead press variations, rear delt rows, direct trap work, and cable crunches. If you already have access to the lifting library because you're already a Vault VIP member, go to your dashboard at 3dmjvault.com and check out the new videos that are there waiting for you at no extra cost. But if you don't already have the lifting library, now is the time to sign up for our Vault VIP membership to get access to all of this and our other 16 courses, because we plan on increasing that subscription price from $12.99 per month to $16.99 per month in early 2023. The annual price will also go up from $69.99 to $79.99 per year. We haven't had a price increase for over 14 months, and since then we've added 4 new courses and 4 other major course updates. So just keep that in mind that once you become a member, you lock in that lower price point while we continue to add more content to your learning dashboard over time. You can sign up and claim your lower membership price at 3dmjvault.com. Again, that's 3dmjvault.com. VIP members will also get access to the Advanced Deload Guide, the Calculating Your Calories course, the Sustainable Fat Loss course, our Injury Prevention and Management Q&A collection, the Lagging Body Parts course, and many, many more. Go to 3DMJ Vault and sign yourself up today. Thank you so much for listening and enjoy the rest of the show. Next question, should concurrent athletes avoid cutting? I'm a half marathon runner and also a member of the 1000 Club, scared to cut because of muscle loss concerns.
Well, awesome. Half marathon, something that I will never do, but I do respect. 1,000-pound club.
What an athlete, honestly.
Yeah, impressive. Big deal. I understand where the reticence comes from. I think the general idea here is, I'm already fighting against the interference effect and opportunity cost. So if I start dieting, it's not going to make things even worse. And I would say it's really no different than someone in contest prep doing a fair amount of cardio and also training. Mm-hmm. You're just doing more. So you just kind of have to think about that. And you want to basically think that you're constraining your recovery resources, right? So if you are going to cut, I would advise doing it during a phase where you're not pushing a lot of volume on either one of your modalities of training. So for example, let's say you're preparing for a marathon or a half marathon while you're still lifting weights. Think about where in your preparation cycle of your marathon where you would have a really high volume of endurance training, and don't cut at that point. You probably want to figure out if let's say, because you benefit from being lighter for running to a point. You don't want to actually be like shredded to the point where you're actually experiencing reds. But there's a reason why marathon runners are often nearly as lean as competitive bodybuilders. They just don't have the muscle mass to quite look the same. So think about where you are on lower volumes of both resistance training and marathon training. And that is probably where I would sneak in little mini cuts, and then make sure for the rest of the time that you're supporting your training. And I think you'll be taxing the system the least amount in those and doing it that way. But I don't think you need to like never cut. Yeah.
Yeah, I have nothing else to really add there. I was going to say the same thing. Just try to sort of periodize the cutting around when you're, away from when you're prioritizing the, the intensity and the volume of those two modalities. But yeah, I think I agree with everything there.
Cool. Next question. How do you define mechanical tension? It has been said it is the primary driver of hypertrophy, but what counts as mechanical tension that stimulates hypertrophy adaptation? I mean, even 5 pounds is a mechanical load, right?
Even 0 pounds on Earth is a mechanical
Gravity
load.
Is a load. Yeah.
I'm going to try to be succinct in this because I could go off. Mechanical tension at its most root level is a process called mechanotransduction, where we're actually taking the stimulus at the fiber level, actually at the sarcomere level, and that is inducing signaling cascades that result in hypertrophy. And I think a better way of thinking of it is just, black and white, there's either mechanical tension or not, is the degree of mechanical tension that is required to induce a sufficient stimulus for you to grow. So for someone who is sedentary and only gets 2,000 steps and is not active at all, going on a walking program has been shown in some cases to be a sufficient mechanical stimulus to actually induce hypertrophy. So yeah, likewise, the fastest way to lose muscle that we have on record is leaving a gravity well. We see pretty substantial and very quick losses of muscle mass in astronauts. We also see it in complete immobilization, where the person is unable to move. You can see really, really quick atrophy occurring. So yeah, you're a correct question asker that mechanical tension is, instead of thinking as a thing, it should be seen as a continuum, The actual site where mechanical tension is sensed is probably a combination of the titin molecule, which is actually the big ass protein complex in the muscle, in addition to what is called costomeres, which are these lateral attachments from the muscle fiber to the surrounding epimysium, I think. That might be the wrong mesium, but I think I got that right.
I think that's right.
Yes, I killed it. So basically, the actual mechanical stretch at the smallest level in your muscle fibers, importantly, not necessarily the whole muscle level, although there could be something there as well. But that's probably more related to, if I had to guess, like stimulating tendon and bone adaptation is occurring at that level, which is why when you do a set of 25 reps to failure, you can actually get sufficient hypertrophy. It's not necessarily like the quote-unquote metabolic stress like we often think of with high rep sets. That might be playing some role, but it is actually, once you're reaching failure, the individual fibers that are fatigued are at a point where they're having to contribute more to that effort as other fibers are unable to where those individual costomeres and titin molecules in that muscle fiber are experiencing high levels of mechanical tension. So mechanical tension can be achieved with various rep ranges, so long as effort is high enough. And with high loads, effort doesn't even need to be that high. You could do 5 reps at a 5 RPE. That's still your 10 RM load. That would probably be maybe not an ideal stimulus, but something. It's still like 77, 80, 82% of 1 RM, depending on the movement and the person. So mechanical tension is basically just the process of where your muscle is experiencing the mechanotransduction. And there's a lot of other things related to that which maybe have an additive or complementary or permissive effect on hypertrophy, like the hormonal response, the metabolic stress, maybe some of the damage processes that come with it, and the downstream effects on satellite cells, or downstream effects on vascularization, microvascularization, improvements in bone density being permissive to future growth. all kinds of shit. But essentially, the initial root motivating factor that allows this growth to occur is mechanical tension, and everything else is playing a secondary or complementary role at best. And that can occur with various loads. What's the rest of the question, Andrea, after the first?
How do you define mechanical tension? What counts as mechanical tension that stimulates hypertrophy adaptation?
So I covered those two. Is there anything else in there?
It was a sum to, I mean, even 5 pounds is mechanical load, right? Like there's a question mark, but
okay,
that's pretty much it. So I think we know what it is. I guess.
Oh yeah.
I think what they're asking is like how much, how do we use it for hypertrophy if it is the goal? What's like the minimal little?
Yeah, this is why progression is important, or overload is important. In that, if you took me and I started lifting, I never went over 135 on bench or 135 on squats, and I never went past a 5 RPE. Yes, there would be mechanical tension in my fibers, but I would shrink. I would start losing size because I'm training so far from what is a sufficient stimulus for me. The amount of mechanical tension I've adapted to, or I should say the magnitude of mechanical tension and the amount of mechanical tension I've adapted to, which is where kind of volume comes into play. Because we also know that it's not just a one-off maximal isometric for 2 seconds once a week that is sufficient to induce a stimulus. It needs to be sustained, and then it also needs to be repeated with a kind of reasonable frequency, which is the interactions of volume and frequency with quote-unquote intensity. So yeah, it just needs to be progressive for you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, that was great. You know, just a couple things to add. I think sort of the way I conceptualize it, like when you look at the length tension relationship, there's like passive tension. So think of that as like whole muscle tension, or, you know, the tension from tendon to tendon. And then you have like the active tension created by the actual cross bridging within the sarcomere. And we know like stretch mediated hypertrophy is mediated most likely from the titin molecule, like you said. And I think that's sometimes influenced by things like sarcomere length, like resting length. Like sometimes, you know, the resting length is a little bit longer and there's less overlap. And so lengthening the muscle is going to reach a greater degree of, I guess, stretch mediated tension on that sarcomere than a sarcomere that's shorter and has more overlap to begin with. So, so I think and Eric, you probably know better than I do, but I think there's different kind of mechanisms between the cross bridging, like the tension sensed through cross bridging versus the tension sensed through the stretch itself. Because you can think of the stretch as like you're pulling in opposite directions, but then you add in the active tension on top of that, and you're opposing that, you know. So there's kind of two different categories that you can sort of consider there. And active tension is obviously very important. Otherwise, you know, stretching, like a loaded stretch just by itself would be probably, you know, would be sufficient, and it might be additive, but you know, having, there you go, your calf experiment. So yeah, I think that's I'm glad you brought up the progression thing, because, you know, like our threshold, think of like as you progress, like your threshold for the amount of tension that you're going to require to sort of meet that threshold to cause this mechanotransduction cascade that's going to increase over time. Is, you know, the lower threshold fibers are able to kind of shoulder more of the load as they, you know, adapt. That means the higher threshold fibers that, you know, have the greatest propensity for growth probably are going to, you know, they're going to require either additional reps or additional load to tap into those.
Well said. And we are still elucidating. When I say we, I probably shouldn't even say we, because I'm far too applied in my research.
Eric
Smarter people than me. I am science.
Eric is science.
Actual muscle physiologists rather than like sports scientists like me who just, you know, tell people to train and then measure whole muscle changes, are still elucidating whether or not there are additive or synergistic effects of what we call stretch-mediated hypertrophy, or more traditionally resistance training-induced hypertrophy. And, what does it actually require? Do we need to have, muscle fibers being active or not in one category versus the other? Obviously, stretch-mediated doesn't seem to be. And whether they're different or not, I don't know. I was thinking about, as you were talking, Brian, like we have two different devices where we can measure someone's mid-thigh pull force output in the lab. One of them is just a chain that attaches to a strain gauge and then to a handle, and you stand on a plate and the chain is attached to the plate. So the strain gauge, which is being pulled apart, is measuring in newtons the force that you are applying, but it's still the same amount of newtons, still force, right? A force plate, however, it has load cells in the plate that can measure your ground reaction force, I guess compression in this case. So it's, I would think, because we're not just a simple load cell or strain gauge, but more so we have like little strain gauges and load cells at a very small level inside our muscle, that they could be additive, they could be different. And, we see some other adaptations that make you think they might be, like changes in sarcomeres and series when you do like loaded stretching in animal models, or when you train at longer muscle lengths versus shorter, and different regional hypertrophy. So I think there's at least enough of a mechanistic rationale to think that they could be potentially additive, which is the whole reason why, for those who've paid attention to my YouTube lives and me on Iron Culture, why I'm playing around with a hour-long calf stretch on a day-to-day basis, except for 1 day a week, while also doing calf training to see if that results in, hypertrophy in the calves beyond what my normal change was. So yeah, anyway, big question mark, long answer to a short question, but cool stuff to come in the future.
Yeah. So if we were to short answer, would it be like, you're right, question asker, anything is mechanical tension, kind of, but when you ask what counts as mechanical tension that stimulates hypertrophy, it's simply like, what have you adapted to? And are you doing at least that much or more? Correct?
You don't even need me, Brian. That was the most straightforward answer.
I'm going to do this whole podcast in 5 minutes after.
That was good.
Just train harder.
Wow, thanks, y'all. I know, right? Okay. Awesome. Next question. How can you know when you can no longer recomp and are forced to either bulk or cut?
I guess I'll just offer my brief input here and kind of let you run with this, Eric. But
okay.
I feel like recomp, it sounds like this unicorn zone that you're very privileged to be in a position to experience, but it seems like in most research, like even in trained athletes, like there's a degree of recomp that occurs seemingly like more often than not. So I think it becomes more of an issue of what's the most efficient way. I don't think you're necessarily, even as an advanced athlete, eating at maintenance. Like if you're, experiencing progressive overload, things are improving over time. Like that's probably being driven at least partially by hypertrophy. Especially if it's something you've been doing for a while. So is it the most efficient path, from point A to point B for a lot of people? Probably not, but I wouldn't really write it off if you're outside of the, the commonly, reported categories of like beginners, injured, or, coming off a layoff, detrained. Like, I think there's still an opportunity to experience that, especially like if you're middle of the off season, like at a, moderate level of body fat. Like if you're shredded, like I think your likelihood of experiencing recomp is going to go down significantly. But, when you have ample body fat in the middle of an off season, like I think you can kind of ride that out and still see a good bit of progress. So, that's my 2 cents on it.
I think conceptually, it's useful to think of adipose tissue and skeletal muscle as two independent systems that are linked to the same fuel cell and environment in some way. and I'll explain what the hell I mean.
Okay.
In that, like, muscle growth is going to occur if the conditions are acceptable to it, and fat loss is going to occur if the conditions are sufficient for that to occur as well. But they are interlinked, because adipose tissue is not just an organ that grows or shrinks. It's also actually providing another substrate for fuel that kind of goes back into the main system. So they are, dependent on one another and impact each other. But conceptually, let's take them separately. And what do we need for muscle to grow, right? We need a sufficient stimulus, and then we also need a sufficient, supply of protein, amino acids, to fuel muscle protein synthesis. And then we need other stuff to not get in the way. So we need to not have a crippling low level of, anabolic hormones in the body because we're experiencing REDs, because we've shredded and dieted for 6 months. We need to not be in a massive energy shortfall so that there's not enough ATP to actually fuel muscle protein synthesis. We need to not have cortisol skyrocketing because we are only sleeping 4 hours a night for months on end, right? So we need the kind of the interconnected system and environment we're connected to have, a normal hormonal profile, a normal metabolic profile, and then it can happen. For that to occur, there are points at which what is happening for fat loss is going to have an environment that is not conducive to muscle gain, right? So if you're shredded, like Brian said, all the shit I just said that is going to impede that process are present. But if they're not present, there's no reason you wouldn't be able to grow muscle. And you just have to think about, that energy shortfall, sufficient protein, right? So at reasonable body fat percentages that are not below your theoretical lower intervention point, or quote unquote set point, and when you're not in a very large energy deficit, you're losing weight with a 10, maybe 20% energy deficit, you can put on muscle mass. And this is observed quite regularly. And this is also a bit of a different conversation if we're doing this by tracking calories or if we're just setting up behaviors. Because one thing that is consistently observed when we look at research where people just give people training and don't mess around with their nutrition is body recomp. It's the default if we just allow people to keep doing ad libitum things. However, shout out to Trexler and Knuckles when they got into their debate about P ratios with Menno Henselmans and a big part of the quote-unquote evidence-based fitness community. They did a participant-level meta-analysis where they looked at some open access data on people resistance training and looked at, okay, what is the relationship between changes in muscle thickness and also changes in body fat? And while the effect was relatively small, they actually found that when adiposity was higher, you seem to more consistently see the ability to put on muscle mass, kind of the opposite of at least that part of the P ratio hypothesis. And we also very consistently see that when people are shredded, like post-comp and bodybuilders, you can give them a very large energy surplus, because that's what you do post-contest. You can keep training, and you're predominantly gaining body water and body fat, because you're not yet fully recovered hormonally to the point where your body can really even put on muscle. So recomp is normal. But if you are creating an abnormal condition for muscle gain to occur, it's not going to happen. So if you change that, then you're probably not in a deficit. So it's just very challenging, except that kind of mid-level for you or higher body fats and small deficits for it to occur.
Yeah. And also in the question when it's like, how do you know when you can no longer recomp? And then like putting that versus a bulk or cut, does that just... When I hear that, it makes me think like you're just eating at maintenance or not so tracking, which you said, which like if you just keep training, technically you would end up recomping because you'd be putting on muscle, but you're not in a deficit. So like it would recomp itself.
Yeah.
Like,
so what actually happens, like in the real world, the experience of trying to do a recomp, let's say your body weight is staying relatively the same. Because it's also like, if we want to get technical about this, if you are losing, like if you're at maintenance and you're recomping, you end up losing weight because the density of fat mass and muscle mass are different, So
visually versus body weight is what you're saying could be a different definition of recomp depending on.
Yeah. So like
if
your body fat percentage stays the same and you gain weight and muscle, your body fat is actually going up a little bit to stay in proportion.
Mm-hmm.
So really what this looks like in the real world when people are kind of quote unquote gaintaining is their body weight is roughly the same. And they're either gaining a little bit of fat or they're losing a little bit of fat while they're putting on muscle.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're actually, most of the time people talk about recomping, they see themselves visually getting leaner while putting on muscle.
Right.
So if that is occurring, you're probably in a slight deficit. So if you are in this situation where you're in a slight deficit, you're losing a little bit amounts of fat and you're slowly gaining muscle. And over the course of 2 years, you're eventually going to get lean enough where you get hungrier and your body will put you into natural surplus. So unless you're strictly tracking for these 2 years to accomplish this, it'll kind of take care of itself. You'll see your body weight stay the same and then come up. It'll stay the same and then come up. And that's actually just the process of you starting to get a little closer towards your lower intervention point, and then your habitual calorie intake goes up, and then it comes down, and it goes up, and it comes down, and it goes up. And so long as you're not really close to your genetic ceiling for muscle mass, and so long as you're training progressively and effectively, that can continue for a while. I do think it's quite challenging. At a certain point, that does just become spinning your wheels, I think, for advanced lifters, and you might have to actually intentionally ensure you're in like 100 or 200 calorie surplus.
Yeah.
But that's not everybody's goal, to maximize the 99.9th percentile of their genetics. So
yeah, and like if you're not competing, when you think about athletes in literally every other sport, in like the Olympics or whatever, that don't consider bulking or cutting necessarily, they just keep training for their sport and they just look more jacked every 5 years. And like it just
they don't worry
happens.
about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Cool. So typically we'd start to wrap this up in the next 10 to 15 minutes. But I have 5 more questions. Do you want to quick fire them or just
Let's go.
Let's do it.
quick fire? All right. Should I like set an alarm on my watch? No. That's crazy.
No.
Right? Okay, but y'all can just mentally be in quick fire mode.
Be fast.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Let's do it.
We'll alternate. So Brian, you're up first.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. Brad Schoenfeld mentioned that volume cycling over 2 to 3 months' time before pulling back won't have any negative effects if done slow and controlled. What are your thoughts on long-term volume cycling?
I think it's fine. I think it's probably naturally how a lot of people end up training in the real world anyway. You know, whether it be going on vacation, getting injured, you know, hopefully not, but often happens. But yeah, there is research, and Eric, you're the research guy here, but where they had, the study I'm thinking of, Eric, is where they had people take, I think it was 3 or 6 weeks off. And then there was one group, I think they trained, was it 18 weeks in a row, something like that. And then they had a group that was doing 3 on, 3 off until they had...
Brian, you sound like a science guy.
Until,
I just want you to know.
Until they reached 18 weeks. Was that right?
I think that's the model. I'm looking it up. You keep talking.
So anyway, what they found was at the end of the 18 weeks, I believe, hypertrophy was the same. And so the idea of, I think it's less to do with like potentiating, like volume cycling is allowing you to go above and beyond the hypertrophy that you could have gotten otherwise, just training all the way through. I think it's more so, to me, it's like great news in the sense that you can pull back, and when you return, your response will be increased to the point where you end up close to on level ground as if you would have trained the whole way through. Which is another reason why, you know, kind of going back to like the powerlifting and bodybuilding question, it's like if somebody's a dual athlete and they want to take some time away from focusing, you know, biasing their training towards development, and they want to increase loads, pull back on volume, it's like at the end of the day, like you probably, like there probably isn't a huge opportunity cost with this in mind, because you can kind of end up your next volume phase, you're probably going to make up some of that lost ground that you had during the lower volume phase that's pushing loads heavier. So yeah, I think, you know, the key to volume cycling, I think, is I look at it more as a tool to managing fatigue and adherence more so than like enhancing progress. And I do think, over time, volume requirements probably do go up. I don't think it occurs, on a acute week to week time scale, which I know, we've talked about in the past. But across a training career, it's like you're not going to be in like a volume trap where it's like your minimum effective dose is determined on what you did the block prior. You're naturally going to be able to kind of cycle volume, pull back, and still be within that range, kind of going back to the inverted U relationship with volume and hypertrophy. It's like you're kind of just bouncing back and forth from, maybe the peak of that curve down to kind of maybe the left of the curve and kind of back and forth. So yeah, I think it's fine. And I think more often than not, it kind of just naturally occurs with people over time without necessarily trying to do it.
That's Ogasawara 2012 comparison of muscle hypertrophy following 6 months of continuous and periodic strength training. One group 24 weeks straight. The other one 6 weeks on, 3 weeks off, 6 weeks on, 3 weeks off, 6 weeks on. Got to the same place in terms of pec cross-sectional area.
So I was wrong on the cutoffs.
You're close.
The general design
stands. Yeah. Okay. Next. Great job, Brian. Okay. How would you program for a power lifter looking to stay in the same weight class? Would you have minimal hypertrophic work? Eric, quickfire, go.
Depends on what their current body composition is, kind of going back to our Recomp one. So the main thing I would figure out is what is the heaviest they can be while having a non-performance negatively affecting weight cut to get down. So let's say they're a 74 and they find they can easily cut from 76 to 74 by just doing a low residue diet. So basically low fiber, high weight, high calorie, like chocolate for most of your energy besides protein for a couple days. And then we just do like a 14-hour fast before the weigh-ins and then rehydrate and eat up afterwards. If you can make 74, awesome. Then I want to make you a 76 with the highest muscle to fat ratio that doesn't go below your lower intervention point. So let's say we'll stick with the 74 kilo category because I already said it. That's a male category. Let's say they can hang out at 12% without issue. I want to make them the most muscular 12% that is at 76 kilos because that's where they can cut from. That is if they are a machine on paper. Of course, they are a human. So you kind of have to approach that as to what do their behaviors look like, what is their family life schedule, all that other good stuff, and what's reasonable. And sometimes the best decision is to actually go up a weight class so they don't have to worry about this finely tuned and manipulating of nutrition stuff. And sometimes the reticence there is they think, well, I'll be weaker. And most people can be similarly strong in more than one weight class. So it's worth thinking about going up if you have to tightly control this stuff, because if you give it enough time at a higher body weight, you might be able to be just as strong as you were.
Okay, dope.
I like it.
He likes it. All right. Brian, how do I judge whether I'm overreaching? I'm doing relatively high volume for my own training, feeling fatigued and some sleep disruptions on some days, but I also just PR'd on main lifts this week. The question again, how do I judge whether I'm overreaching?
I think by definition, overreaching, and Eric, correct me if I'm wrong here, but it's in the presence of a reduction in performance, is it not?
Yeah, it's just the difference between overtraining and overreaching. Functional, basically it's a continuum. Functional overreaching, non-functional overreaching, overtraining. Functional overreaching is you come back above baseline in a relatively short period. Non-functional, it doesn't get back above, it might get back to it, takes longer. Overtraining, it stays suppressed and actually goes down for a long period of time.
Yeah. So you're probably not overreached in the sense of what he's describing there. But I don't think I kind of look at fatigue management as addressing whatever the weakest link is in your ability to sustain good performance. And if you're feeling very fatigued, and sleep is starting to get disrupted, I would imagine overreaching could be, just around the corner potentially. If joints are banged up, then like that's in advanced athletes, I think one of the biggest bottlenecks. And so managing things and sort of managing periods of lower volume or deloading to keep those things at bay. Sometimes often I'll sort of default to managing around those versus performance. Because in many cases, I don't feel like you need to wait until performance drops in order to justify a deload, in other words.
Yeah, there's only one thing I want to add, because this is important, is that strength is one of the last performance metrics that drops off from overtraining. And importantly, there's important shit that starts to go south far before that, like motivation to train, mood state, sleep quality, health. And there's actually a term that I've seen appear in the literature on overtraining called mechanical overreaching or mechanical overtraining, which is basically another word for an injury. And the fact that they had to create that definition means that it occurs before overreaching, overtraining occurs, which is where you're actually seeing a loss of performance. So you can be doing things that are leading you to Snap City, even though your performance is not suppressed. And if you're thinking, well, I'm fine, I'm not overreached or overtrained, let's just keep pumping the progression, that can be a bad idea. So I am not a fan of only using the sports science definition of overreaching or overtraining as an idea of when to take a deload. I think it should be one of many metrics that your performance is going down. But if your joint injuries are up, or sorry, if your joint pain is up, your motivation to train is down, and your sleep is trash, but you're still improving performance, take a deload.
Yeah.
Agreed.
Or y'all talked about you can take a pretty, like a few week
You could.
big drop in volume and it would end up in the same place. Okay. 2 more. Next question. What do you think of running very long hypertrophy phases, like months long, as a power lifter? I've done power building for 3 years and have some minor injury accumulation. Oh my God, this fits in with the combo so well.
Definitely a good idea to get away from the movements that are causing pain.
Yes.
And do them the minimum amount or with modifications that allow you to be pain-free to then fully recover from that. And then refer back to our question earlier in this podcast about training for both hypertrophy and strength. And just think about the timeline of when you're leading or having your next competition. So if you've got a while before you're going to compete again, then absolutely, you just need to find the bare minimum effective dose, perhaps after you actually fully recover, and you may lose just a little bit of strength, but it's in the greater service of improving long term, and focus on getting more yacked, because it will probably be the net best outcome of you having more muscle mass, being fully recovered, figuring out your minimum effective dose to maintain or even slowly improve on the main lifts. And then you can come back into your training reassessing, was I doing too much volume? Was I doing too much specific volume? And are there ways where I can more efficiently and with less fatigue progress as a powerlifter? I think it's probably a good idea in the circumstances to do that hypertrophy block. Extended hypertrophy training, I should say.
Agreed. I think with powerlifting, and just strength training in general, I think people look at specificity. They don't look at it through the lens of like, okay, what's contributing, like what's specific to the adaptations that we're trying to accomplish. They sort of look at strength as the direct adaptation. And so I think people look at like, okay, running, backing off of back squats, squat, bench, dead, and doing, maybe some machine work that feels better. Like they feel like it's a step backwards towards their goals. But like you said, it's just sort of improving downstream capacity, to produce force. And I think, the same thing, it's kind of like a bodybuilder, like in the middle of the off season, that doesn't have abs, feeling like they're doing something wrong. It's not specific to like game day performance, if you want to call it that, but it's a necessary part of the process to improve.
This is sort of unrelated, but actually, no. A few questions in this podcast have made me wonder, like, what would be... It seems like a big continuing fear is like, I'm scared of losing absolute strength with every powerlifting question, right? Is like, if I get weaker, like, so when someone asks, how long can you drop volume, or how would you do powerlifting and bodybuilding? They all kind of come from like being scared to not be my strongest. And we've talked about in other podcasts, and I know it's like a common thing that we have to remind ourselves and our athletes, is that you won't be your strongest all the time because game day, like what Brian just said, like not having abs in the off season doesn't matter for a bodybuilder. It's a little bit scarier for a powerlifter to lose their strength. But how long would you say that it's okay for a powerlifter to not have their max decrease, and for what amount, if that makes sense? Like without them, without it, because we've said lots of times, like you won't be the strongest all the time. You can take breaks, blah, blah, blah. But like at what point is it too long or too far from your peak performance?
I think powerlifters would be surprised at how quickly strength can come back when they do leverage specificity, especially after a layoff, because you don't need much volume. I'll use a personal anecdote to provide some context here. So 2017, I got bilateral surgery on my hips, repaired labrums, and shaved cam lesions for FAI. So I had been unable to actually do low bar squats just low bar squats to depth since 2013 for more than a couple weeks. So in competition was most of my low bar squat volume, and in the 1 or 2 weeks leading up, I could maybe get 5 heavy reps in total leading into them without creating problems that actually suppress my strength in competition. And I basically held on to just 490-ish squat for 4 years. Then I got hip surgery, and I had to take many weeks off of squatting. I was able to start actually squatting to depth 12 weeks post surgery.
4
and
months.
At the
3 months.
At the 20-week mark, I hit a high bar PB.
So that's like a year in total. Many years of keeping a 490, about half a year of none or very light load for you squatting, and then
basically 4 years of sporadic but very specific squatting to maintain it, and then a full 3 months of not being able to squat at all, at least specifically, and then within 2 months hitting a PR from once I brought back in, doing literally just working up to a single at around 8 RPE 3 times a week.
Yeah.
So, and with no volume.
Yeah.
And I worked up to a high bar PB. So that's just some context that it does come back very quickly. A less injury specific one was that I did weightlifting for all of 2020, about 10 months of it, not doing any low bar squats at all, and only doing high bar squats. Correct.
Yeah, snatch and clean jerks.
Yep. I think my high bar squat was 170, 180 at most. So it was actually down by about 20 kilos because it's so far above my snatch and clean and jerk, it didn't matter. I was just doing it to maintain my strength to a sufficient degree. And then I did a 6-week prep for a powerlifting meet and started doing relatively frequent singles between 2 to 4 times a week on the main 3 with very little back off work. And 6 weeks, I squatted 210 low bar. And then in the next competition, that was 6 or another 3 months after that, with training in a similar vein and slowly bringing it back in volume into lifetime PR, and I hit 500 pounds, or 501, 227. So I think there is far less to lose, especially in well-trained powerlifters, to take some time away, even if their strength does notably regress by, say, 10, even 20%. If they are still able to train and maintain muscle mass, those movement patterns can come back really quickly.
Thank you. I really messed up the quick fire mode that we were supposed to be in. I'm sorry.
It's okay.
That's a good question.
Okay. Cool. Last one. How do I judge? Oh, okay. That was the wrong question. All right. Where do you see the fitness industry in the next 10 years, and what contributions do you hope to make during that time? Great question to end on.
I'm going to say one negative thing and one positive thing. I'll be quick, and then I'll let you go, Brian. Negative thing, I think the push towards social media platforms that are less permanent and seem to reward lower attention spans is going to make things worse in the industry perspective. But at the same time, I know a ton of people who are now getting into academia, who are also practitioners, who are in their mid-20s, or it's not really important how old they are, but they're young is my point. Some of them are older, but they're starting their careers just a little late. And they are coming up and they are a decade ahead of where I was, and practically experienced coaches. And I think that the distinction between like lab coats and in the trenches people is going to diminish. And I think there's going to be more people who understand good information and know how to communicate it and apply it in the space. So while there will be a very kind of distracting, like Fifth Element, Chris Tucker nonsense going on, you know, screaming loud lights, terrible information always, I think there's also going to be ample opportunities to get really good information from a lot of different sources with broad representation, where a lot of people feel like they can find someone they relate to. And so long as we can increase the literacy side of people, then the first problem I brought up will be less of an issue.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I look at like TikTok fitness content, and it's yeah, I'm a little pessimistic when I look at that, looking into the future. But there's also, I mean, there hasn't been a better time than now with the amount of research that's being done. And, you know, I feel very fortunate. I'm not a researcher, but, you know, as somebody who's, you know, using this information, you know, relaying this information to help people reach their goals, I think one thing I would like to see in the next 10 years is, this may not happen, but seeing people, I guess I see a lot of like ego on social media. I feel like a lot of people in the fitness industry are more concerned with like viewing themselves as correct than they are actually like helping their audience. So less like tribalism would be nice. I suspect that may get worse before it gets better. So yeah, the other thing, I'm hoping in the next 10 years, we finally know if lat pull downs train the lats.
Big questions.
So,
yeah.
Hopefully someone will look into that.
Yep.
We're doing our best. We're plugging our TikTok, which we feel like is helpful. So just want to say that.
Our
That's us
platform's
fighting the
trash.
fight.
Here's our account.
Fighting the fight. We have a TikTok amongst a sea of terrible TikTokers. We're the only good TikTokers that you should follow.
And we need to see less tribalism. Yeah. Everyone else sucks.
We're the only, you should get TikTok and only follow us. No, I'm just
That's
kidding.
right.
Contributions we hope to make in our time. Lat pull. That's it. In 10 years, that's our mission. We actually changed our company mission statement after
that
this.
That was a joke. But yeah, I mean, I think just contribute to the solution of just getting good information out there and genuinely trying to help people and being an example. You know, if you're incorrect about something, like don't cling to it, and help that like shape your identity. Like, you don't want to be like, I don't want to ever be looked at as like a fitness professional that's like, this is the blank guy, you know, the guy that is, you know, the high volume
progressive overload guy.
Yeah, the progressive overload guy.
The lat pull
but
guy.
yeah, I think like if you feel like you've, you know, painted yourself into a corner with your views on things like that can be a bit of a problem. So yeah, just trying to stay open-minded as new evidence emerges, and yeah, use it for the purpose that hopefully we're all doing this for, and that's to help other people. So
yeah, I'd say contributions, I have been trying more and more over the last 12 years. That's probably longer, to focus not only just on putting out correct information, but also helping people to think about things, like how to think, not just what to know. And I even tried to, like in this podcast, every time there was a question where I was like, well, how are you thinking about this? I tried to point that out. So I have the privilege of doing that at AUT and helping people pursue that more formally, but I also hope to keep doing it on podcasts and in, you know, on whatever platforms we use to get people to think about the how that they learn and the information behind it, not just the what is the right answer. Because I think that's the only inoculation against the pseudoscience and constant stream of overwhelming amounts of information.
Mm-hmm. All right. We did it, gents. That was good. Thank you guys for taking the time to be on your own
Thank you, Andrea.
To be on your own
Thank
podcast.
Thank you for hosting.
Sure.
Yeah, we really appreciate it.
Sure thing. All right. We'll see y'all next time.